New patch was just revealed and people aren't happy. Vyšlo video od Rivala. Nějaký update na lolečko. Vlastně dnešní update, s kterým jsem dneska už hrál. Já jsem si vůbec nečetl Patchnotes, ale všechno je tam změněný, mi přijde. Hodně věcí je jinak, itemy se skládají úplně jinak. Celý je to takový zvláštní, tak se pojďme mrknout, co si o tom myslí tady náš lol zpravodaj.
Hey, my mustache gone. No. News has been a bit few and far between as we ramp up into Worlds, so I thought I'd take this opportunity to run you guys through what we can expect in patch 14.20. Obviously, this isn't a released patch.
Dívej se, kolik tady toho je, ne? Dívej se, kolik tady toho je, ty vole. Šílený. Komu se to chce číst, jako? Komu se to chce číst?
Things can always be changed until it is live, but most of the time, 90 to 95% of things that the balance teams speak of preemptively do end up on live servers. So, without further ado, this is what we can expect in the second patch of Split 3. First up, we're going to run through the nerfs. While these hold the same power as buffs in the meta, I feel like the community cares more about what's being buffed because it means we're going to be seeing more of them in your solo queue games. So let's get the champion and item nerfs done first. But if you do want to skip ahead, all of the timestamps will be in the video timeline below. Mundo is receiving a slight nerf to the damage on his E, with his E max HP into bonus AD going from 2 scaling to 3.4% down to 2 to 3%. This won't really change anything, to be honest, considering the main part of his DPS is the consistent landing of his Q. Maybe a slight nerf to his wave clear, but that's late game anyway. Next up is Jhin, losing a bit of his AD growth, going from 4.7 down to 4.4, and his R base damage is actually losing a fair chunk, with rank 1 being unchanged, rank 2 going down 26 damage, and rank 3 losing 52. The causation for this nerf will be explained later in the video. Mordekaiser is next under the hammer. Get it? Yeah. I know it's a mace, whatever. His Q isolation is losing 10% at rank 1 all the way to max, going from 40 to 60% to 30 to 50%. This nerf only pretty much hurts him post 6. It's not often Mordekaiser is hitting isolation Qs in lane, and if he is, you're doing something wrong, but when he takes people to Brazil, there's obviously nothing to obstruct his isolation Q damage. Moving on is Poppy with an increase to her passive cooldown. That's her grasp buckler pain in the ass she throws over the minion wave, chunking you with no trade-off, going from 13 to 7 up to 16 to 8 second cooldown. Her Q on monsters is going down as well as her E damage too. The more Poppy nerfs, the better. Shyvana is losing 2% off her W move speed AP ratio, going from 12% down to 10, and her R damage is losing a pretty decent chunk from 130% down to 80%, but this seems more impactful than it really is. I assume this means the collision damage, like when she flies on top of you, in which case, what AP Shyvana is diving into the enemy in the first place. I digress. Singed is losing some armor.
A tohle je jakoby první vlna těch nerfů, na to, že chci snížit celkově jakoby damage ve hře, nebo bude ještě nějaká další? Asi jako čekám, že ještě něco bude, ne?
Growth from 4.7 down to 4.2, and Skarner's passive damage is losing some scaling, with his E damage also going down based on his max HP. Udyr's QQ and RR are being nerfed on monsters, which will of course affect his clear speed, as well as his E movement speed will be receiving a slight blow, going from 30 to 65% down to 25 to 55%. And lastly for the champions, his most uninteresting part of his kit, Veigar's W AP ratio is losing 10% off its scaling. Now for systems, which obviously means items and runes. I'm going to put up the whole list on the screen, but the main one I want to talk about is the Grasp of the Undying nerfs. This rune has become pretty rampant in the last season or so, seeing more and more popularity creep, allowing champions that are typically quite weak in the early game to bypass these windows to become late game beasts that are enabled by their items. Riot also feels like it was being picked by way too many non-tanks for a tank keystone, which they are so right about. Such champions that are a good example of these are Jax and Camille, who have used this keystone for seasons, and lately Yasuo and Yone. Not only does proccing the actual keystone fit well into these champions' trading patterns, none of these particular champions actually need a keystone to succeed, now that lethal tempo is gone anyway. The resolve tree also gives inadvertent tankiness through secondary runes like Overgrowth and gold income through Demolish, allowing for even faster scaling. To combat this window avoidance, Riot is removing a bit of the heal that Grasp gives while also nerfing the max HP per stack by quite a lot, going from 7 melee 4 ranged to 5 melee 3 ranged, a much needed nerf in my opinion. Now onto the buffs. We'll start with the systems because there's only 3. Nimbus Cloak was slightly over nerfed recently, so they're reinstating a tiny bit of power. Yuntal Wild Arrows is going down 250 gold, but also losing 5 AD and...
Jako tam ten item nikdo nestaví, že? To je docela k ničemu. Ale oni ho i nerfujou, oni ho zlevňují, ale ho i nerfujou. No nevím, jestli to pomůže teda.
And bleed damage, and the Collector is going down 450 gold, but...
Ok, oni tomu vemou 10 AD, ale slevnějí to o 400 pade. Docela v pohodě, ne? Jako tím, že to je o tolik levnější, to je asi i lepší, no. Podle mě, jako 10 AD, whatever, že? Tam jde o ten efekt, že vyšlíráš killy, pak. Hlavně kvůli tomu to kupuju, že?
Losing 10 AD, so a net buff. I went to find out what the play was here with this item, and this net buff happened because, quote from Froxon, Collector is receiving a net buff, but still, the champions received a bigger hit than what Collector is being compensated for. Buffs to Kate, Aphelios as a result, which I'm about to touch on in a second. He then continued, we also know that this will be a relative buff to Jhin for normal play as Shiv is being nerfed and Collector is being buffed, so we're putting in a small compensation to Jhin, who even prior to this patch was creeping up to be one of the top champions in the role. This obviously references to the nerf that we
Jhin, no? Pravda.
just. And now for the 1420 champion buffs, what we've all been waiting for because there are some saucy ones. As Froxon said, Kate and Aphelios are receiving compensatory buffs, with Aphelios getting slightly more base HP and base AD on his passive, with Kate getting a bit more attack speed and damage on her Q pass-through. Everyone's favorite champion to be back in the meta, Corki's Q will now cost less mana, as well as an increase in his W damage, and his E is also costing less mana late game. And now for a couple of controversial ones. Lee Sin, Pantheon, and Riven are all receiving buffs due to their core item in Eclipse getting a nerf recently. Lee is getting 3 more base AD, Pantheon's W max HP damage is going up, and Riven's Q is getting a slight buff, which I think is the wrong way to buff her, but anyway. I also don't think Riot realizes this also is a buff to Riven's early game proxying, which is already a bit too strong in my opinion with how mobile she is as a champion. I also want to add to that, I think proxying is going to get nerfed really soon. I think it's a little bit too strong in generating tempo. We'll see. I'm going to quote myself if it does. Now for the most controversial.
Za Riven se dá jako proxy, jo, už early game, jakože jdeš za turretu a farmíš.
According to Froxon, Yone, Yasuo, and Tryndamere were hit pretty hard by core item nerfs.
Jako třeba na levelu 1, to asi ne, spíš jako na levelu 4, 6.
Specifically Bork and IE. Riot also don't like how Yasuo and Yone have been straying from crit for a while now, so to incentivize this, they're both receiving buffs to their Q crit damage, going from 80 to 90%, which, given how often they both Q, it's actually a pretty sizable buff. And they're also seeing a fair bit of play at the moment. People are even saying that Yone...
Jako zrovna Yasuo a Yone mají docela obrovský damage, no. Tím, že mají oba 100% crit, když máš 2 crit itemy, tak damage je nechutnej, no.
Receiving buffs at the moment is kinda insane. Oh, and Yasuo will also be
why buff the wind shitters, no.
Getting more armor pen through his ult with his R bonus armor pen.
To jsou vrát čempové, který mají jedny jako z největších DPSek ve hře, že?
On crit going from 50 to 60%, further incentivizing his building of crit items. As for Trinda, our favorite tower diver, his attack speed growth and armor growth are both going up. Very solid buffs to his split pushing, because obviously you'll be able to hit towers faster and take less damage from them. And that about covers all of what we can expect to see in patch 1420. If you enjoy this type of content, feel free to leave a sub, but because it is a new style of video, some feedback on what can be done better is also welcome. Anyway, I'll see you guys in the next.
Ok, to je tak strašně moc změn, že ty vole, já nevím vůbec, co si o tom mám myslet. A je to asi nějaká první vlna, ne, těch nerfů a buffů, co jakoby, o kterých mluvili, ne, se mi zdá. Že bude těch vln asi víc, co? Uvidíme, jako nechápu, proč buffuju toho Yoneho a Yasuo zrovna. Líbí se mi, že trochu buffnul Lee Sina, ale nevím, jestli 3 AD je úplně něco, co jako vole, vystřelí vole až na vesmír. Tomu se ani nedá si nic říct, tak uvidíme, co se začne hrát ve hře, že? Hlavně, jak to bude vypadat, co se bude stavět, co se bude pikovat, to uvidíme, co z toho vyklube, no. Jaký budou další změny, co tam ještě vymyslejí Riotáci.